Picture this. It is the morning of April 11, 1241. Archbishop Ugrin Shak, the most powerful clergyman in Hungary, stands in a muddy war camp on the banks of the Sujo River. He is 60 years old, armored in chainmail over his clerical robes, a mace in one hand and a crucifix in the other. He has just ridden back from the bridge where his crossbowmen slaughtered a Mongol vanguard in the darkness. Bodies are still floating in the current. He storms into the tent of King Bela IV and screams at him. Not a polite rebuke, a full public humiliation. He calls the king a coward. He calls his nobles fools. He demands the entire army mobilize immediately. The king stares back and does nothing. By sunset, Ugrin will be dead. So will every bishop, every baron, and nearly every knight in Hungary. An entire nation's ruling class erased in a single afternoon. The man responsible is not in the camp. He is 2 miles downstream, knee-deep in freezing river water, personally supervising the construction of a makeshift bridge in total silence. He is 65 years old, so heavy he has to ride in an iron-wheeled cart instead of on horseback, and he is about to deliver the most devastating defeat in European medieval history. His name is Subutai. You have almost certainly never heard of him, and that is the greatest injustice in military history. This is the Battle of Mohi, the story of how a blacksmith's son broke the spine of Christian Europe and then vanished from memory like smoke. Before diving into these forgotten stories of war and genius, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The insult that started this war was almost comically petty. In 1235, a Turkic chieftain named Khotan, Khan of the Cumans, rode into the Hungarian court draped in wolf pelts and gold steppe jewelry, dropped to his knees before King Bela IV and begged for sanctuary. His people were fleeing the Mongol advance. Bela said yes. He baptized Khotan, gave his 40,000 riders land, and thought he had gained the finest light cavalry in Eastern Europe. What he had actually done was hand the Mongol Empire a casus belli. From the Mongol perspective, the Cumans were property, fugitives, and the man who would punish Hungary for harboring them had been studying the country for over a year. 6,000 miles to the east, in the Mongol capital of Karakorum, a 60-year-old general named Subutai sat in his iron-wheeled cart and reviewed intelligence reports his spies had been smuggling out of Europe. He charted Hungary's roads on silk maps. He catalogued which fortresses were stone and which were wood. He noted which nobles hated the king and where the rivers could be forded. This wasn't a barbarian planning a raid. This was a systems analyst planning a hostile takeover with cavalry. Now in Western popular culture, the Mongols are often depicted as a screaming horde of savages on horseback, winning through sheer numbers and animal ferocity. That is propaganda, pure and simple, written by the people they defeated. The army Subutai assembled for the European campaign was a precision instrument. Each soldier carried a composite bow with a draw weight exceeding 150 pounds, strung with sinew, effective at 500 meters. That outranged anything in the European arsenal by a factor of 3. Each rider brought multiple spare horses, allowing columns to cover 120 kilometers in a single day, while a European army staggered through 30. And the man calibrating this instrument had been doing it since he was a teenage doorman. Subutai was born around 1175 near the upper Onon River, the son of a blacksmith named Jarchigudai. He was not a Mongol by blood. He belonged to the Uriankai clan, forest-dwelling people who mended broken pots and traded furs for their steppe neighbors. At 14, he left home and walked into the camp of a minor tribal chieftain named Temujin. His first job was holding the door flap of the chief's tent, a literal doorman. But the doorman was listening. Through that felt flap, young Subutai absorbed every word as the future Genghis Khan discussed strategy, alliances, and betrayals. Within a decade, the boy who held tent flaps was holding the fate of nations. Genghis Khan called him one of his 4 dogs of war. The secret history of the Mongols describes them. They have foreheads of brass, their jaws are like scissors, their tongues like piercing awls, their heads are iron, their whipping tails swords. In the day of battle, they devour enemy flesh. Remember those words, they will matter later. By 1241, Subutai had personally commanded the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire, led a 9,000-kilometer cavalry raid around the entire Caspian Sea, crushed the combined Russian princes at the Kalka River, and helped conquer northern China. He had directed more campaigns, won more battles, and conquered more territory than Alexander, Caesar, and Napoleon combined. And now he was coming for Europe. But first, Hungary would destroy itself. Weeks before the Mongols arrived, Bela's own Hungarian nobles turned on the Cuman refugees he had sheltered. A mob broke into the royal camp and murdered Khan Khotan in his own tent under the king's supposed protection. The enraged Cuman cavalry, all 40,000 riders, turned south and pillaged Hungarian villages as they withdrew. Bela lost his best light cavalry to his own people's bigotry before the enemy even crossed the border. And someone, 6,000 miles away, was counting on exactly this kind of chaos. Subutai didn't just study armies, he studied human stupidity. His plan for the invasion was not a battle plan. It was choreography. He split the Mongol army into multiple columns operating over 1,000 kilometers apart, each with independent objectives, all timed to converge simultaneously. One column under a general named Kaidu punched into Poland. On April 9, 1241, at the Battle of Legnica, they annihilated the army of Duke Henry the Pious of Silesia. Henry was killed trying to retreat. The Mongols filled 9 sacks with severed ears from the dead. This wasn't the main attack. This was the distraction, and its sole purpose was to ensure that no Polish reinforcements reached Hungary in time for what came next. 2 days after Legnica, and 1,000 kilometers to the southeast, Subutai was about to spring his trap. King Bela IV of Hungary was a tall, thin man, with a long face and a longer memory for grudges, who wore a golden circlet over his mail coif and carried a ceremonial mace he almost never used. His nobles had pressured him into marching northeast from Pest with approximately 50,000 men. He had Europe's finest heavy cavalry, armored knights on massive war horses, carrying lances and longswords, supported by crossbowmen whose steel bolts could punch through Mongol lamellar armor at close range. On paper, this was a formidable army. In practice, it was a coalition of feuding nobles who despised their king. The Mongols retreated before the Hungarian advance. Slowly, deliberately, they let Bela chase them for a week, harassing the flanks with hit-and-run raids, wearing down the horses, stretching the supply lines thin. This wasn't a retreat, it was a fishing line. Subutai was reeling them toward a spot he had personally selected, the plain of Mohi, where the Sajo River created a natural barrier and the flat terrain was perfect for mounted archers. He positioned his forces in the dense woods on the east bank, invisible to scouts. The Hungarians camped on the west bank in a wagon lager, a circular fortress of wagons chained together, wheels interlocking, oxen tied to the axles. They thought they were safe. They had just locked themselves in a cage of their own making. On the night of April 10th, Batu Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan and nominal commander of the Western campaign, sent a vanguard to seize the stone bridge over the Sajo. Batu was a young prince of the blood with sharp Mongol features, riding in gilded lamellar armor with a tiger-skin saddlecloth, far more interested in glory than caution. What he got was a catastrophe. Prince Koloman, Bela's younger brother, was a battle-hardened warrior who had campaigned from Croatia to the Carpathians, a man who wore his chainmail like a second skin and favored a longsword heavy enough to split a Mongol shield rim to pommel. Archbishop Ugrin Shak was no soft clergyman either. Weeks earlier, he had tried to ambush a Mongol column on his own initiative, only to be lured into a swamp where his heavy cavalry sank to the saddle girths in mud. He had barely escaped with his life. The humiliation had transformed him. He was no longer fighting for Hungary, he was fighting for redemption. Together, Koloman and Ugrin marched 7 kilometers through pitch darkness with crossbowmen and mounted knights. They reached the bridge at midnight and caught the Mongol vanguard halfway across. The bridge was over 200 meters long, and the crossbowmen turned it into a kill zone. Heavy steel bolts fired from windlass crossbows at less than 50 paces tore through Mongol lamellar and leather armor as if it were linen. The narrow bridge negated the Mongols' greatest advantage, mobility. They couldn't flank, They couldn't scatter and regroup. They were funneled into a corridor of death. The vanguard was slaughtered nearly to a man. Koloman and Ugrin rode back to camp in triumph, left a detachment to guard the bridge, and went to sleep. This wasn't a victory. It was a trap the Hungarians had sprung too early. Because while the crossbowmen were stacking Mongol bodies on the bridge, Subutai was 2 miles downstream, doing something no European commander would have thought possible. In the freezing April darkness, his engineers were sinking timbers into a section of the Sajo too deep to ford, assembling a pontoon bridge plank by plank, all while Mongol archers fired suppressing volleys to mask the sound of hammering. Subutai didn't think in battles. He thought in systems. Batu's bridge assault was never meant to succeed. It was a fixation attack, designed to glue every Hungarian eye to the north, while Subutai crossed the river to the south and appeared behind the camp at dawn. But this night, the river was deeper than his scouts had reported. The bridge construction fell behind schedule, and upstream, the Hungarians were about to remind the Mongols that European knights were not easy prey. At dawn on April 11th, Batu launched his second assault on the bridge. This time, he brought 7 stone throwers, catapults normally reserved for demolishing city walls, and aimed them at men. Massive rocks and incendiary projectiles rained onto the crossbowmen guarding the west bank. The impact was like nothing they had ever seen. A bolt of Greek fire struck a knot of soldiers and scattered them like burning insects. This was one of the first recorded uses of artillery as tactical fire support in Western warfare, and the Hungarians had no reference point for it. You cannot hold a position against a weapon you don't understand. The barrage drove the crossbowmen back. Batu's cavalry began to pour across the bridge, but the Hungarians were not finished. Koloman and Ugrin rallied their knights and charged the bridge a second time. Armored war horses slammed into the Mongol light cavalry at a full gallop. The physics were savage. A European destrier weighed over 1,000 pounds, a steppe pony weighed 600. When they collided on a narrow bridge, the lighter horses crumpled. Mongol riders were thrown into the river. Lancers punched their weapons through lamellar chest plates that were designed to deflect arrows, not absorb the kinetic force of a couched lance driven by a half-ton of galloping horse. The Mongols were driven back across the bridge in brutal hand-to-hand fighting. Here is where we need to correct another misconception. The Mongols are often treated in popular history as an invincible tide. They were not. At the bridge of Mohi, Batu Khan personally led an assault on a Hungarian strongpoint and lost 30 of his own bodyguards, and a lieutenant named Bakatu. Chinese sources confirm that only Batu's personal courage prevented his entire wing from breaking and fleeing the field. The Hungarians were fighting with a ferocity that genuinely shocked the Mongol command. When Koloman and Ugrin fought their way back to camp and begged the king to deploy the full army while the Mongols were pinned against the river with the Sajo at their backs, they found Bela frozen. He had not issued a single order to prepare for battle. Ugrin publicly savaged the king for the second time that morning, screaming at him in front of his own nobles. Finally, the Hungarian army began to mobilize. But the delay was fatal. It gave Batu just enough time to finish the crossing. By 8 in the morning, the Mongol main force was across the river. The Hungarian knights pushed back hard. Their armored wedges drove into the lighter Mongol cavalry, and for a brief, furious hour, Hungary was winning. Batu's wing was bleeding. His men were being compressed against the river they had just crossed. Then the sound changed. From the south, behind the Hungarian camp, a wall of dust rose against the morning sky. Subutai had finished his bridge. 30,000 riders were thundering up from nowhere, closing the trap from behind. The Hungarians turned and saw the impossible, a second army where there was no bridge, no ford, no road. They were now surrounded on 3 sides, the river at their backs. Koloman rallied enough men for one final charge. He leveled his lance and drove his heavy cavalry straight at Subutai's line. The impact was tremendous. Mongol ponies went down screaming. Riders were trampled under iron-shod hooves. For a few hundred meters, the Hungarian knights carved through the lighter troops like a mace through wicker. But Mongol cavalry does not absorb a charge. It parts. It flows around the impact like water around a stone, then closes behind it. The knights punched through and found themselves cut off, surrounded, peppered with arrows from every direction. At this range, Mongol composite bows drove bodkin-tipped shafts through the gaps in chainmail. The neck where the coif met the hauberk, the inner elbow where the sleeve rode up, the back of the knee where no smith could hang enough rings without crippling the rider. Koloman fought his way back to the camp, but the wounds were mortal. He would bleed to death within days. Inside the wagon lager, the Hungarian army was now trapped. This wasn't a battle anymore. It was a siege in the middle of a field. Tens of thousands of arrows arced over the chained wagons and fell into the packed mass of soldiers below. The heavy plate and chainmail that made European knights unstoppable in a charge became a prison. They couldn't run. They couldn't maneuver. They stood shoulder to shoulder while arrows found every seam, every hinge, every joint their armorers had never imagined being tested from above. Then came the fire. Incendiary projectiles, what some historians believe were early Chinese gunpowder weapons, sailed over the wagon walls and set tents ablaze. Smoke filled the lager. Horses screamed and kicked free of their tethers, stampeding through the packed men. Soldiers were crushed by their own comrades. And then Subutai played his final card. He deliberately opened a gap in the encirclement. This wasn't mercy. This was the most cold-blooded tactical calculation of the entire battle. Subutai understood a fundamental truth about human beings. A surrounded army with no escape will fight to the death. A surrounded army with one visible exit will run, and running men cannot fight. The gap led to a swampy lowland where the ground sucked at boots and swallowed hooves to the fetlock. Terrible footing for armored war horses, perfect terrain for Mongol riders who could stand in their stirrups and shoot over their horse's rump at a full canter. Bela saw the opening and took it. He fled with a small escort, and when the king ran, the army shattered. What followed was not a battle, it was an extermination. The Hungarian soldiers poured through the gap, throwing down their weapons, ripping off their mail coats to run lighter. The Mongol horsemen rode alongside at a leisurely pace, loosing arrows into the staggering crowd. Men fell in rows. Thomas of Split, a Dalmatian clergyman who later interviewed survivors, left a description that has haunted historians for 8 centuries. He wrote that the Mongols began to rain spears upon the fleeing men from all sides, cutting them down with swords, sparing no one, and that the entire way was covered with their wretched bodies. The ground turned red with blood. Archbishop Ugrin Sak died in the slaughter. The man who had survived the swamp, who had won the bridge twice, who had screamed at his own king to fight, was cut down running. So fell another archbishop, 3 bishops, the Templar master Rembold de Vauxhall, and virtually every baron in Hungary. The ears collected from the dead, following Mongol post-battle accounting tradition, filled 9 large sacks. Estimates vary, but somewhere between 40,000 and 65,000 Hungarians died at Mohi and in the pursuit that followed. The entire military and political leadership of one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms was decapitated in a single morning. And the man who designed it all watched from a hilltop across the river. He didn't draw a sword. He didn't fire a bow. He had done his killing with geometry, timing, and a pontoon bridge built in the dark. This wasn't a battle, it was a masterclass. The days after Mohi revealed something about Subutai that was, in its way, more terrifying than the battle itself. Most conquerors celebrate after a victory this total. Subutai exploited it, and the way he did it produced what might be the most absurd scene of the entire Mongol invasion. Among the wreckage of the Hungarian camp, Subutai's men recovered a prize more valuable than any weapon, the royal seal of King Bela IV, a heavy golden stamp used to authenticate royal decrees, the medieval equivalent of a president's signature. Subutai looked at the seal, looked at his translators, and made a decision that sits somewhere between genius and comedy. He started writing letters, official-looking, beautifully formatted royal decrees, stamped with the golden seal of the King of Hungary, and dispatched them by rider to every major town and village in the country. The decrees ordered the Hungarian people to remain calm, stay in their homes, and cooperate with the authorities. The authorities, of course, were the Mongols. Town after town received what looked like a legitimate royal order. The seal was authentic, the language was formal, the wax was correct. Mayors read these decrees aloud in town squares. Peasants put down their pitchforks and went back to their fields. Local militias disbanded. Gates that had been barricaded were opened. And then the Mongol columns arrived and found undefended, cooperating populations waiting for them like dinner guests who had set their own table. Thousands of Hungarians obeyed forged documents from the man who had just destroyed their army because the paperwork looked right. It remains one of the earliest and most effective examples of psychological warfare through bureaucratic deception. This wasn't conquest. It was the world's first hostile corporate takeover, complete with forged letterhead. For the next 10 months, the Mongols systematically dismantled Hungary. Nearly half of the country's inhabited places were destroyed. A quarter of the population perished. In some lowland areas of the Great Hungarian Plain, there were almost no survivors at all. Subutai began planning the next phase. Austria, then the German states, then Italy. His scouts had already mapped the roads. Then a message arrived from 6,000 miles away. Great Khan Ugadai was dead. All princes of the blood had to return for the election of a successor. When Batu hesitated, suggesting retreat after the heavy losses at the bridge, Subutai overruled him. He declared he would not stop until his forces reached Pest. He was right, and he knew he was right. Europe could be taken, but politics achieved what no European army could. The princes turned east, the columns followed, and Subutai rode away from the continent he had just shattered. He would never return. The end of Subutai's story is not a battle. It is not a siege. It is a quiet atrocity committed by history itself. He went home. He supported the election of Genghis Khan, who promptly removed him from the European theater. Not because Subutai had failed, because Genghis hated Batu Khan, and he didn't want the empire's sharpest weapon available to his political rival. So at the age of 70, the greatest military mind in human history was reassigned. He was given command of the campaign against the Song dynasty in southern China, because apparently conquering half the known world earns you more work, not rest. He campaigned for a year. Then in 1248 he came home for the last time. What happened next contains more tragedy than any battlefield. When Subutai left the Mongol court, he stripped the badges of rank from his yurt. He removed every marker of status, every symbol of 60 years spent reshaping the map of the world. Then he walked outside, looked across the grassland near the Toul River, and went to his herds. The man who had coordinated the simultaneous destruction of Poland and Hungary 1,000 kilometers apart, who had personally overseen the fall of northern China, the Khwarezmian Empire, the Russian principalities, Georgia and Central Europe, spent his final days doing what his father had done before him, watching over animals. One account says a visitor found him there, tending sheep, and asked him how it felt to have conquered the world. Subutai is said to have looked at the man the way a wolf looks at a dog and replied, "I did not conquer the world. I served the man who did." Even in retirement he was holding the door flap, still the servant, still the dog of war loyal to a master 20 years dead. He died in 1248 at 72 or 73. The exact date is unrecorded. The cause is unrecorded. The grave is unmarked, following Mongol custom that concealed the burials of prominent figures to prevent desecration. The greatest conqueror in the history of warfare was swallowed by the steppe grass as if he had never existed. And for the next 700 years, the West forgot him completely. Not suppressed, not censored, just forgotten. His campaigns were buried in Persian chronicles and Chinese dynastic histories that European scholars never bothered to read. While schoolchildren memorized the conquests of Alexander and Caesar, men who took a fraction of the territory Subutai took, the blacksmith's son became a footnote in other people's stories. It was not until 1927 that a British theorist named B.H. Liddell Hart pulled Subutai from obscurity. He used Subutai's campaigns to argue that the future of warfare lay in speed, dispersion, and mechanized mobility. The German and Soviet generals who would fight World War II read that book. Rommel studied Subutai. Patton studied Subutai. The entire Soviet doctrine of deep battle, the operational theory that broke Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, was derived from the tactics of a man who died tending sheep 7 centuries earlier. History loves a crown. It loves a golden mask, a tragic exile on a lonely island, a beautiful young conqueror who dies before he can disappoint us. Subutai had none of that. He did not build a dynasty. He did not write memoirs. He did not die young or dramatic. He just won and won and won and then went home and watched the sheep. We remember Alexander because he died before he could grow old. We remember Napoleon because he lost beautifully. And we forget the man who conquered more of the earth than any human being who ever lived, because he committed the one sin history never forgives. He was competent instead of glamorous. If you made it this far, you're a true history enthusiast. Please verify your subscription now. It really helps the channel keep these forgotten stories alive. Check out this next video on the screen about the Mongol invasion that changed the course of civilization. I'll see you there.